I didn't disappear all at once. If I had, someone might have noticed. There would have been questions, confusion, concern, maybe even an attempt to stop me. But that's not how it happened. I faded. Slowly enough that no single moment felt alarming. Quietly enough that every change looked reasonable on its own. I remained present in form, attending, responding, functioning while something essential inside me stepped back. At first, it felt like maturity. I stopped reacting emotionally to things that used to affect me. I learned how to stay composed. I told myself that distance was wisdom, that detachment meant I was no longer controlled by impulses. People praised me for being calm. I accepted that praise as proof I was evolving. What I didn't realize was that calm can be a symptom. Not of peace. Of withdrawal. I started choosing the easiest version of myself to maintain. The one that didn't ask too much. The one that fit neatly into expectations. The one that could be relied on without ever causing discomfort. That version required very little of me. So I gave it everything. I stopped sharing thoughts that felt inconvenient. I stopped voicing doubts that didn't have clear solutions. I stopped expressing desires that might complicate things. Each silence felt small. Insignificant. Justified. I told myself that not every thought needs to be spoken. That not every feeling deserves attention. That adulthood is learning how to filter yourself. I became very good at filtering. I filtered disappointment until it sounded like acceptance. I filtered exhaustion until it looked like discipline. I filtered loneliness until it resembled independence. From the outside, I was fine. That's why no one noticed. I showed up on time. I fulfilled responsibilities. I smiled when appropriate. I listened more than I spoke. I became agreeable without being weak, present without being vulnerable. I wasn't lying. I was editing. And when you edit yourself long enough, you forget what the original sounded like. I noticed it one evening while brushing my teeth. I caught my own reflection and felt nothing. No recognition. No dislike. Just neutrality. As if I were looking at someone familiar but irrelevant. That moment unsettled me more than fear ever could have. Fear implies engagement. This was absence. I realized how long it had been since I felt urgency about anything personal. Not about deadlines or obligations, about myself. I didn't long for things anymore. I didn't resist much either. My internal world had flattened into something manageable and quiet. I told myself this was balance. But balance without tension is just stillness. And stillness, when it lasts too long, becomes disappearance. I began to understand that I had confused being low maintenance with being healthy. That I had mistaken silence for strength. I had become someone who didn't require much space. Because I had stopped taking it. I remembered earlier versions of myself, louder, messy, more uncertain. At the time, I had been eager to outgrow that person. To become composed. Respected. In control. I succeeded. But control has a cost. It demands distance. Distance from reaction. Distance from desire. Distance from parts of yourself that don't behave conveniently. I had put those parts far enough away that they stopped knocking. Days passed smoothly. Too smoothly. Without friction, time lost texture. Weeks blurred together. I couldn't tell one month from another without checking a calendar. Nothing bad happened. That's what scared me. Because nothing good happened either. My life became something I managed rather than lived. I kept everything running but rarely asked where it was going. I started to sense that my presence had become optional. People didn't rely on my perspective, only my availability. They didn't ask what I thought, only whether I could handle things. I was useful. I wasn't known. And worst of all, I wasn't missed. Not because I wasn't important, but because I had learned how to make myself replaceable. I had trained the world not to notice my absence by never fully arriving. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with shame. Shame for how willingly I had shrunk myself. For how often I chose ease over expression. For how easily I accepted invisibility as peace. I realized that my disappearance wasn't something done to me. It was something I cooperated with. Day by day. Silence by silence. Choice by choice. I hadn't lost myself suddenly. I had slowly stepped out of my own life and kept the door open so nothing would slam loud enough to wake me. And now, standing there in that quiet bathroom, staring at a reflection that felt more symbolic than real, I understood something I could no longer deny. If I kept going like this, I wouldn't vanish dramatically. I would simply finish disappearing. And no one would be able to say exactly when it happened. Once I noticed how far I had faded, I expected fear to pull me back. It didn't. What I felt was familiarity. Disappearance had become normal. Comfortable, even. When you withdraw slowly enough, the absence doesn't feel like loss, it feels like relief. Fewer reactions. Fewer explanations. Fewer risks of being misunderstood. I told myself I was simplifying my life. In reality, I was erasing friction. And friction, I learned, is what proves you're still here. I began to see how often I avoided situations that required me to take up space. Conversations where I might disagree. Decisions that might reveal preference. Moments where my presence would actually matter. I chose neutrality. Neutrality felt safe. It allowed me to exist without committing. To be involved without being exposed. To remain present without being accountable to my own desires. I called that balance. But balance implies two sides. I had only one. I realized how rarely anyone asked me what I thought anymore, not because they didn't care but because I had trained them not to expect an answer that would change anything. I was dependable in a very specific way. I wouldn't disrupt. That realization hurt more than rejection ever could have. Rejection implies visibility. This was something else. I started noticing how people spoke around me instead of to me. How decisions were made with my presence assumed but my opinion unnecessary. I was included structurally, not personally. And I had allowed that. Because it required nothing from me. I remembered how I used to argue. How I once cared enough to insist. How disagreement felt like engagement, not danger. Somewhere along the way, I had decided that harmony was more valuable than honesty. So I stopped pushing back. I stopped clarifying. I stopped asserting. Not because I didn't have opinions. Because expressing them felt like work. Work that might disturb the fragile ease I had built around myself. I began to understand that I wasn't disappearing because I was ignored. I was disappearing because I made myself easy to overlook. I had learned to compress myself into something manageable. Something predictable. Something that fit. I watched how easily people moved on without me in small ways. A conversation continued when I stepped away. Plans adjusted without my input. My absence went unremarked. Those moments stung, but they also confirmed something I had been avoiding. I had become optional. Not in a dramatic sense. In a quiet, structural one. The world had reorganized itself around my reduced presence. And it worked. That's what made it so dangerous. Nothing broke when I pulled back. Nothing demanded my return. I realized how much I had mistaken necessity for meaning. I thought being needed was proof of value. When I stopped being needed, I assumed I had lost something essential. But the truth was subtler. I had stopped offering anything irreplaceable. I had removed the parts of myself that might cause friction, perspective, emotion, resistance, and kept only the parts that maintained flow. Flow doesn't notice individuals. It just continues. I started feeling tired in a way I couldn't explain. Not exhausted, hollow. As if I were carrying less and less of myself each day. I slept, but didn't rest. I worked, but didn't engage. I spoke, but didn't reveal. Everything functioned. I didn't. I tried to tell myself this was temporary. That once things stabilized further, I would reinsert myself. Speak up more. Care more. Be more visible. But I didn't know how. Visibility felt dangerous now. Once you've made yourself small, becoming large again feels like intrusion. I feared being seen as difficult. Emotional. Inconvenient. Those fears kept me quiet. Quiet kept me invisible. I noticed how rarely I felt anger anymore. Or excitement. Or anything that might require expression. I lived in a narrow emotional range where nothing asked too much of me. That range felt calm. It was also lifeless. I realized that disappearing isn't something you feel all at once. It's something you get used to. Like dimming a light gradually. Your eyes adjust. The darkness doesn't shock you until one day you realize you can barely see. I wondered how long I had been like this. How many moments I had chosen ease over truth. How many times I had edited myself until there was nothing left to say. I thought about all the times I told myself, it's not worth it. Not worth explaining. Not worth arguing. Not worth feeling. Those decisions felt small. Together, they were my life. I wasn't afraid of disappearing. I was afraid of reappearing. Reappearing would mean reclaiming space. Risking discomfort. Accepting that my voice might not fit neatly anymore. It would mean choosing presence over peace. And peace, the kind that comes from absence, was tempting. But it was costing me something I could finally name: connection. Not to others. To myself. I realized that if I continued like this, my life would remain stable, calm, and manageable. And entirely forgettable. Even to me. That realization didn't panic me. It sobered me. Because it meant the danger wasn't catastrophe. It was completion. Completion of a process that had started so quietly I never noticed its beginning. I didn't know yet how to stop disappearing. But I knew I couldn't keep calling this peace. Because peace doesn't erase you. And whatever this was, it was erasing me. The moment I accepted that I was disappearing, I expected urgency. A surge of panic. A desperate need to be seen again. Some instinct that would force me to reclaim space. None of that happened. What arrived instead was clarity. A calm, unsettling clarity that made excuses impossible. I realized that disappearing had never been accidental. It wasn't something that happened to me. It was something I had chosen not once, but repeatedly, because it made life easier. Easier to manage. Easier to explain. Easier to survive without friction. I had mistaken ease for peace. But peace doesn't cost you your voice. I began to see how deeply I had internalized the belief that being unobtrusive was a virtue. That taking up space was selfish. That harmony required self-reduction. No one explicitly taught me that. I learned it by watching what was rewarded. I learned it by noticing when things ran smoothly, when I stayed quiet, agreeable, flexible. I learned that the less I insisted on myself, the less resistance I faced. So I kept reducing. I told myself I was being considerate. In reality, I was disappearing to avoid discomfort, mine and everyone else's. I realized how much of my identity had been built around being easy. Easy to work with. Easy to rely on. Easy to overlook. I had optimized myself for continuity, not meaning. And continuity, when it excludes presence, becomes erasure. The most painful part wasn't that people didn't notice my absence. It was that I had trained them not to expect my presence in the first place. I had removed the parts of myself that might cause pause, opinion, emotion, resistance until what remained was useful but indistinct. I had become background. And backgrounds don't get missed. I sat with that truth longer than I wanted to. Not because it was cruel. Because it was accurate. I realized that reappearing wouldn't be a dramatic act. It wouldn't look like confrontation or rebellion. It would look like inconvenience. To others. And to myself. Reappearing would mean saying things that might disrupt flow. Expressing needs that might not be welcomed. Holding positions that might not be absorbed easily. It would mean accepting that presence creates friction. And friction creates visibility. I had avoided visibility for so long that it felt dangerous. But disappearing felt worse. Because disappearing didn't just erase me from others' lives. It erased me from my own. I stopped asking how to become who I used to be. That question was another form of escape. Instead, I asked something simpler and more honest: what would it mean to be here today? Not efficiently, not politely, but truthfully. The answer wasn't dramatic. It was uncomfortable. It meant speaking when silence was easier. Pausing before agreeing automatically. Allowing myself to feel reactions instead of filtering them immediately. The first times I did this, my voice felt unfamiliar. Like it hadn't been used in a while. Some people were surprised. Some were confused. A few were resistant. That hurt. But the hurt felt clean. It wasn't the dull ache of self-erasure. It was the sharp reminder of existence. I learned something essential then: presence doesn't guarantee acceptance. But absence guarantees irrelevance. I didn't become louder. I became clearer. I didn't reclaim everything I had given up. Some parts of me were gone not because they were taken, but because I had let them fade for too long. I grieved that. But grief is proof that something mattered. And for the first time in a long while, something did. My life didn't transform overnight. I didn't suddenly become central, admired, or indispensable. But I became involved. Time slowed down. Moments carried weight again. Days left impressions instead of dissolving. I felt resistance from others and from myself, but resistance meant contact. Contact meant I was here. I understood then that disappearing is seductive because it feels like safety. It removes risk, conflict, and exposure. But it also removes participation. And participation is the only thing that makes a life yours. If you're listening to this and you recognize that quiet fading, that sense of becoming easier to overlook with each passing year, I want you to hear this without urgency, without blame. You didn't disappear because you were weak. You disappeared because disappearing was rewarded. And because reappearing felt risky. But risk is not the enemy of peace. Avoidance is. I didn't lose my life all at once. I almost lost it by cooperating with my own absence. Now, I choose differently. Not loudly. Not perfectly. But deliberately. I allow myself to be felt even when it disrupts. I allow my presence to matter even when it complicates things. Because a life that runs smoothly without you in it is not peace. It's erasure. And after years of fading quietly while everything continued on schedule, choosing to be here visibly, imperfectly, undeniably is the first act of loyalty I have ever offered myself. Not to be noticed, but to exist.